Welcome to the CIDCI online salon. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here this morning or afternoon, depending upon your time zone. CIDCI's mission is to accelerate change in the built environment by convening innovators for educational programs. We also serve as a trusted source of information about innovation. Special thanks to all of our sponsors who make this all possible. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge what a difficult time it is for many of you who now juggle homeschooling, caring for elders, and your day job, all from your home, maybe from your dining room table, just like me. It's a lot. Some of you are back to your workplace or planning for others to return. We urge you to be compassionate with yourself as well as those you live with and work with. Here is a note about the very special nature of today's talk. Most CIDCI presentations relate to the way we do our work together, exploring issues like the opportunities of prefab or how blockchain can transform capital projects. Today, CIDCI board member Dean Reed has invited a historian to talk with us about innovation through a very political lens. Joining us from his home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan is Clifford Conner, a historian of science. Cliff taught history of science at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and he is the author of two books I'd like to draw your attention to, A People's History of Science and the forthcoming book, The Tragedy of American Science. Cliff also studied experimental psychology and industrial engineering at Georgia Tech and worked briefly as a human factors engineer at Lockheed Aircraft before resigning in protest against the Vietnam War. We live in unprecedented times. Many of us live in places under curfew and quarantine. Cliff will help us consider the big picture in the context of the current pandemic and explosive political situation. What drives innovation? What should drive innovation? Who is in the driver's seat? Is the fundamental purpose of innovation to make life on Earth richer for everyone or to make corporate shareholders richer? Cliff, can't thank you enough for joining us. We're looking forward to your presentation. Please take it away.
Thanks, Margie, and greetings to you all. As Margie said, my name's Cliff Conner, and I'm a historian of science. I thank CIDCI, the Center for Innovation in the Design and Construction Industry, for inviting me to speak today. Before I begin, I want to express my solidarity with the courageous demonstrators all across the country whose protests represent what I think is truly great about this troubled country of ours. And then I want to tell those of you who don't already know something about our host organization, the CIDCI. I know there are other people tuning in as well. It's a professional organization of the AEC industry, and AEC stands for Architects, Engineers, and Construction. These are the creators of what Margie referred to as the built environment. When we hear the word environment, we close our eyes and think of mountains, meadows, and lakes. But when we open our eyes, what we see are buildings, streets, and water tanks on rooftops. That's our built environment. For a city dweller like me here in Manhattan, when I see trees and grass and a body of water, it's in Central Park, and it's the Central Park Reservoir. Public parks are also part of the built environment. I'm going to be talking about the general topic of innovation, but I want to discuss innovation in the context of the built environment. To set the mood, I'm going to take just a minute to put a series of images on the screen. In addition to the more obvious aspects of the built environment, a great deal of it is mostly hidden from view. Even in the hallways we walk through, there's a lot of our built environment we don't see. In addition to creative exteriors, there are creative interiors as well. From bold, innovative designs, detailed plans are drawn, foundations are laid, structures emerge, and structures grow, and the result is the material expression of our civilization, our built environment. In this talk, I want to focus on potential innovations in two particular aspects of the built environment. First, medical facilities like the one on the screen now, and hospitals. And second, industrial agriculture and factory farms. Just a couple of months ago in April, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which is often hailed as the beginning of the environmental movement. Again, people usually think of that in terms of the natural environment and demands for clean water, clean air, and pesticide-free food. But of course, the environmental movement had a major impact on the built environment as well. It led to restrictions in building codes, for example, to prevent unscrupulous developers from building communities on top of chemical dumps. On the one hand, the new regulations, which were first decreed, by the way, by the Nixon administration, increased the challenges for architects and engineers and builders, but at the same time, it stimulated their ingenuity in the pursuit of innovation. I think it's fair to say that professionals in the AEC industry embraced that challenge because they wanted to create safe and healthy places for people to live and work. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the investors who funded the projects. Investors have often engaged in extreme efforts, legal and illegal, to evade safety and health regulations. And that brings us to the consideration of yet another aspect of our environment. In addition to the natural environment and our built environment, we also exist in a social environment. Our social environment is dominated and shaped by legal, economic, and political factors. And with regard to innovation, it's the social environment that's decisive. I'm speaking to you now from my sheltering-in-place apartment in Manhattan, as Margie said. I don't know how things are where you are, but for me and my wife, Marush, today is day 84 of our lockdown regimen here in what's been called the epicenter of the pandemic. It doesn't take a historian to know that this is going to be a chapter in the history books for a long, long time to come. I was asked to address the general topic of innovation, and I think right now some of the potential innovations foremost in our mind are in the sphere of medical science. The answer to the question posed by the title of this webinar, Innovation for What, seems obvious in this case. We want innovations that will produce a cure and prevention. But in reality, the answer is much less straightforward. The ultimate goal of COVID-19 research has to go beyond cures and prevention. As the epidemiologist Rob Wallace has passionately declared, clearly humanity shouldn't start reacting to a pandemic when it's already underway. Let's stop the outbreaks we can't handle from emerging in the first place. I'm going to argue that the innovations we need to stop them in the first place are not to be found in the biomedical sciences, but in the social sciences. The only solutions that will allow our long-term survival will require substantial, meaningful social change in the way we produce and distribute and consume goods and services. Yes, we do need a COVID-19 vaccine, and the sooner the better. The pathogen that causes COVID-19 is an RNA virus rather than a DNA virus. It's a single helix rather than a double helix. And that's significant because RNA viruses have by far the highest mutation rates of any organisms on Earth. RNA viruses mutate literally 1 million times faster than DNA viruses. The nightmare scenario that epidemiologists have been worrying about for years is the possibility that a combination of mutations would produce a pathogen that would cause a perfect storm pandemic. If you can read the small print on that slide, you'll see that the headline is from 2014. The CDC's epidemiologist had predicted what we're seeing now 6 years ago. The perfect storm of a deadly viral strain would be one that maximizes all 4 of these traits. One that can infect humans, lay low and hide itself for a while, jump easily from victim to victim, and kill a large proportion of those infected. The odds of such a virus emerging in nature are infinitesimally small, but modern industrial agriculture has created conditions, to use a familiar phrase, that now make it a matter of not if, but when. We've been hearing the phrase existential threats a lot lately. The first big existential threat to the human race came out of the Cold War, the threat of thermonuclear Armageddon. One medium-sized exchange of hydrogen bombs between the Soviet Union and the United States could well have destroyed all human life on Earth. Cold War policymakers tried to convince us that that was an exaggeration, but it wasn't. More recently, we became aware of another existential threat, that global warming could soon make the Earth uninhabitable for human beings. And now the threat of a perfect storm pandemic adds yet another existential threat to the list. These existential crises are the ultimate expression of the need for innovation. You'll notice the word anthropogenic at the top there. You've heard global warming identified as an anthropogenic phenomenon, meaning that it isn't natural. It's caused by human activity. The corollary is that if human beings caused it, we should be able to innovate our way out of it. A tremendous amount of human creativity has gone towards solving that problem, and yet it just seems to keep getting worse and worse. Why is that? The answer is that the innovations have been limited to technological fixes that ignore the social context at the root of the problem. The root of the problem is that the fossil fuel industries are trillion-dollar industries, and the people who own them don't want to lose their trillion-dollar investments. And if they can protect their trillion-dollar investments by spending a few $1,000,000 to buy political influence, that's what they'll do. If an innovation to solve that problem can't be found, all the wind farms and solar panels and coal scrubbers in the world won't save the planet. And there's a perfect analogy between that and why the long-term threat the pandemic presents to us can't be averted by vaccines and antiviral medicines alone. Because we think of viruses as natural phenomena, you might think COVID-19 isn't anthropogenic. But in fact, the danger of ever more threatening viral contagions is a result of human activity. They're a consequence of the growth of agricultural practices that began after World War II. Gigantic poultry and livestock farms all over the world are the essential breeding grounds for novel viral infections. First reports of the novel coronavirus in Wuhan at the end of 2019 gave epidemiologists reason to fear that this could well be the nightmare they had long anticipated. The epidemiologist I quoted earlier, Rob Wallace, declared in a book he published 4 years ago that much of the world's economic productivity stands to suffer catastrophically if a deadly pandemic were to erupt, for instance, in southern China. When you hear that, you may think Rob Wallace was peering into a crystal ball, but of course he wasn't. He was demonstrating the predictive power of a science heretofore underappreciated by the general public and policymakers alike. And his conclusion is clearly stated in the title of his book, Big Farms Make Big Flu. Gigantic factory farms were a post-war innovation in agricultural organization that first arose in the American South. But multinational poultry and livestock producers and processors such as Tyson Foods and the CP Group spread them overseas in poorer countries where even inadequate US regulation wouldn't apply and lower wages could be paid. The spread of these factory farms was relentless, as this comparison reveals. From before World War II to the post-war period, the average number of chickens in a commercial flock grew from fewer than 100 to tens of thousands. I'm sure you're familiar with Tyson Foods, which has been in the news a lot lately, but the other company I mentioned, the CP Group, isn't exactly a household name in the United States. It's a corporation based in Thailand, and as one of the world's largest conglomerates, it operates poultry factories across 2 billion chickens China sells every year. Aware of the cruelty to the chicken, well-meaning consumers try to counter these practices by paying high prices if they can afford to, or eggs that are allegedly laid by free-range chickens. Some states have attempted to ban the abhorrent factory farm practices, or at least regulate them, and yet industrial egg production continues to grow, both in volume and in geographical scope. The victimized birds are silently avenging themselves for the suffering inflicted upon them by spawning plagues to torment us, the human race. Crammed together by the tens of thousands in warehouses all over the globe, the hens' unhealthy bodies create a huge pool of opportunities for novel viruses to come forth, mutate, and multiply. Poultry farms are the most notorious incubators of viral disease, but they are not the only culprits. Others are hog farms and other livestock farms, and increasingly, the incorporation of wild animals, including bats, into agribusiness operations. And because these bountiful breeding grounds are often located in close proximity to population centers, the transmission of their viruses to humans is greatly increased. The preponderance of evidence suggests that the mutant coronavirus causing COVID-19 first appeared in bats. That in no way absolves agribusiness of responsibility. The chain of causation is complex, and whether wild or farmed bats were the original source, big food indisputably created the underlying social and ecological conditions for this pandemic's emergence. Despite what grocery store labels claim, the farmed animals are not natural. The chickens, ducks, and geese on the poultry farms, for example, are genetic monocultures, domesticated birds that have been selectively bred to a high degree of uniformity. Their resulting lack of diversity makes the nearly genetically identical fowl all the more susceptible to raging contagion. If one bird in the flock is vulnerable to a particular disease, they're all vulnerable to it. At the first signs of illness, the factory farms pump their flocks full of antibiotic and antiviral drugs, prompting natural selection to create superbug pathogens with ever higher resistance to the pharmaceuticals. The bottom line is that industrial poultry and livestock farms pose a clear and present danger to all of us. Please don't blame the messenger, but I have to remind you that COVID-19 is expected to return in waves. And beyond that, the probability of ever novel global pandemics is all too real. Everyone, even those who have never been moved to protest the cruelty to the chickens, should recognize that it's in every human being's self-interest to demand fundamental innovations in the current factory farm system. But the answer cannot be to simply destroy the existing factory farms. They have to be replaced with something else. And that's where architects, engineers, and builders have a major role to play. Deconstructing the existing system of mega farms and rebuilding in their place a system of large-scale regenerative agriculture with technologies geared to revitalizing the soil and preventing the industrialized production of viral pandemics would represent the most valuable, innovative achievement imaginable. Now let's consider another problem that the current crisis has revealed to us. Why was the American health system so shockingly underprepared for this pandemic? Part of the problem was an abysmal failure of leadership on the part of the federal government. But there's more to it than that, and it goes straight to the heart of the discussion in this webinar, the nature of innovation in American science and technology. The exposure in March and April of this year of inadequate medical supplies and hospital capacity throughout the United States revealed a crisis 4 decades in the making. The shortage of ventilators and ICU beds was not a matter of poor planning. It wasn't even a matter of criminal negligence. It was a culmination of a conscious policy decision committed with intent. Intentional downsizing of hospital emergency capacity began 40 years ago during the Reagan administration and has continued to the present, and now we're paying the price. Historian Mike Davis describes the consequences of years of profit-driven cutbacks of inpatient capacity. According to the American Hospital Association, the number of inpatient hospital beds declined by an extraordinary 39% between 1981 and 1999. The purpose was to raise profits, but management's goal of 90% occupancy meant that hospitals no longer had the capacity to absorb patient influx during epidemics and medical emergencies. And the upshot was that by March of this year, American hospitals could provide only 65,000 ICU beds, while the government's own experts warned that the need for intensive care during a pandemic could amount to literally millions of patients. The same historian also exposed the roots of another critical deficiency in pandemic preparedness. Big Pharma has seriously underinvested in antibiotic and antiviral research because it offers less profit potential. And that's why we're having to scramble now for a new viral vaccine. Of the 18 largest pharmaceutical companies, 15 have totally abandoned the field. Drugs like Viagra and opioid painkillers like OxyContin are where the profits are, not defending us against new diseases. As an example, a universal vaccine for influenza, that is to say, a vaccine that targets the immutable parts of the virus's surface proteins, has been a possibility for decades, but never profitable enough to be a priority. That's a powerful example of what motivates and guides and directs the pursuit of innovation today in the United States, and most of the world for that matter. If human needs were the motivation, of course we would be pursuing a universal flu vaccine. But that wouldn't be the case if the motivation is profit maximization for big pharmaceutical corporations. A universal vaccine would undermine the profitability of the seasonal flu vaccines that Big Pharma wants to sell to us every year. So the general answer to the question, innovation for what, in the here and now, is not to make life on our planet richer for all creatures, but to maximize corporate profits. There's a major qualification to that general principle, but unfortunately, it doesn't make things better, it makes things worse. In my forthcoming book, The Tragedy of American Science, I argue that since World War II, American science and technology have been devoted to military purposes to a degree far beyond what most of us are aware of. And what that means is that the spirit of innovation in the United States, rather than being the creative engine of human progress, has instead been hitched to the chariot of destruction. Military research is geared toward discovering innovative and more efficient ways to kill people in large numbers. Stated that bluntly, this may strike you as an extreme and unjustifiable claim, but there's plenty of evidence to support it, and I'll give you a few key examples. The military's influence on American innovation can be measured by its share of the nation's resources that are devoted to research and development. Way more than half of the money in science and technology budgets go to the Pentagon, which is the blue part of the pie there, the nuclear weapons program, which is the Department of Energy, the green part, the space program, the CIA, the NSA, and so forth. You may or may not be aware of a government agency known by its acronym DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA has undeniably been a major source, and I would argue the major source, of American innovation since 1958, when it was founded. It does have a public face, but most of its research is hidden from public scrutiny and public oversight as classified national security secrets. DARPA's official mission is to provide the American military with innovations that will give it an advantage over any and all potential enemies. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis made it clear that the military's purpose is to wage war, and the focus of war is to kill enemy combatants. I'm not subtle, he said. I need to make the military more lethal. So if you ask DARPA innovations for what, there's your answer. DARPA's innovations have included intercontinental ballistic missiles, drones the size of fighter aircraft that fire Hellfire missiles, biomimetic micro-drone robot assassins, and transhuman cyborg super soldiers of the Terminator type, a familiar face here for many. But not all of its brainstorms have been so obviously war-oriented. Many have been things we all know and marvel at. Have you ever searched the internet for information, used a GPS while driving to find your way around, asked Siri or Alexa a question? All of those innovations were also products of DARPA's military research. They're called dual-use technologies because they can have civilian as well as military applications, but the point is they were created to serve military purposes. Siri originated in a DARPA program called PAL, Personalized Assistant That Learns, the largest artificial intelligence research project in American history. In DARPA's own words, PAL's mission was, quote, to make military more lethal. The same goes for GPS, which were all DARPA innovation, but you get the point. Even your microwave oven was a byproduct of military research. So the first answer to the question, innovation for what, is innovation for profit, and the second answer is innovation is for war. We learned from the COVID-19 crisis. The rapid collapse of large segments of the economy we're witnessing now demonstrates the instability and the unreliability of our current system of production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. We have to wonder, will the economy recover when the pandemic subsides? It might, but we can't know yet. There are no guarantees. Optimists predict a V-shaped recovery fueled by so-called pent-up demand, while pessimists fear that we may have permanently entered into what they call a doom loop. And here's the multi-trillion-dollar question. I suspect the system's limitations have only begun to be exposed. The invocation of the Defense Production Act to produce ventilators, PPEs, and other necessary medical supplies reminds us that the investor class, the financiers, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists are not essential to production. The investor class is essential to the functioning of the current economic system, but not to the one that we need for survival. The way to cut the investor class out of the picture is by nationalizing the major industries, not only the medical equipment manufacturers, but big pharma and the insurance companies as well. In our present system, the investor class organizes them and controls them and gets fabulously wealthy by taking all the profits for themselves. But we don't need them to organize the production system. And then the profits could be returned to where they belong, to us, to the general public, to the society as a whole. And while we're thinking about nationalizing the medical corporations, why stop there? Why not nationalize the fossil fuels industry and begin to solve the climate change problem? Why not nationalize the military-industrial complex so we can solve the nuclear holocaust danger? And just imagine how much money that would save. When people ask, how do you propose to pay for all these social benefits you're talking about? There's your answer right there. The trillions of dollars that we spend now on nuclear weapons alone, not the whole budget, just the nuclear weapons, would pay for everything I'm talking about with a lot left over. And finally, the crisis has revealed how completely wrong-headed Ronald Reagan was when he declared big government can't solve your problem. The big government is most clearly revealed in the outrageously inflated military budget. There's the paradox in spades. The United States is governed by people who claim to hate big government while sustaining the biggest, most powerful government the world has ever seen. And what did we learn when the economy began to shut down in the face of the pandemic and tens of millions of workers lost their jobs? It wasn't private enterprise that came up with trillions of dollars to ease their suffering. It could only have come from big government. So one thing this crisis has already demonstrated beyond question is that we absolutely need some kind of big government. The size and complexity of our society is such that it can't exist without a high degree of organization, and that requires governance. Unfortunately, the big government we actually have is not the big government we need. The most obvious indication of that was in the federal government's pathetic response to the COVID-19 crisis. Among other things, it actively undermined the science we needed to fight the pandemic. And way too much of their multi-trillion-dollar bailout wound up in the wrong pockets. So to sum it all up, here's the bottom line. The innovation we need most is a complete transformation of our socio-political economic system. That requires two preliminary innovations. First, the key industries that we depend on have to be nationalized. Second, the government we need to operate those nationalized industries has to be remade from the bottom up. It's not just a matter of getting rid of the pathologically corrupt clowns who are running the country now. The whole system of government that's controlled by corporate financial power, including the military-industrial complex, has to be replaced by one that's controlled by us, we the people. If we're to survive the three existential dangers I described earlier, we really have no choice. Now I want to end with a shout out to the members of our host organization, the CIDCI, the engineers and architects of the construction industry who create our built environment. We need you now more than ever. We need you to direct your innovative talents and your creative spirit toward renewing the crumbling infrastructure of our post-industrial societies. We need you to create more hospitals with more ICU rooms, more clinics and laboratories, more school and university facilities, rather than more casinos, resorts, golf courses, and other vanity projects for billionaires. We need you to build innovative, affordable housing rather than luxury skyscrapers and gated communities. We need you to help dismantle the for-profit prisons and build humane alternatives in their place. We need you to build sanctuaries for refugees rather than border walls and military bases. Today, you are constrained by economic necessity, the need to make a living, to place your creativity at the service of corporations and financial institutions and the Pentagon. Until that changes, you won't be able to fully realize your potential value to society. And for that reason, most of all, we need your solidarity in the struggle to create a better world. I urge you to never forget that American policy today is controlled by a remarkably small number of billionaires. For every one of them, there are 100,000 of us. We are many, they are few, and therein lies our hope for the future. Thank you.
Cliff, that was amazing. Really, really profound thoughts for everyone here. I want to apologize. We had some bandwidth issues a couple of times during your presentation. So just so you know, thank you, Monica, for trying to monitor that. So we did lose a couple of little parts, but I think most people really caught the essence of the conversation. My question to you is, you have some of the leading architects and designers and builders in the United States and Canada on this call. What specifically would you be advising and directing them to be thinking about in terms of innovation beyond what you've outlined in your last couple of moments?
The problem there is I can't be as specific as I know you'd like, because you're asking about technological solutions, which would require specific expertise that I don't have, but I think maybe I can point you in a useful direction. Taking large-scale agriculture as a prime example, what specific steps might be taken to prevent the industrialized production of viral pandemics? I mentioned earlier that two major factors in the emergence of novel viruses are the close confinement and the lack of biodiversity and massive flocks of chickens, geese, and ducks. And what I can say is that there are already many people thinking about these things, and they're continually generating innovative ideas. Organic farmers in many countries are working hard to create and develop a new agricultural built environment, if you will, that uses the manure of free-range chickens as fertilizer to prevent soil exhaustion, that uses biotechnological alternatives to chemical pesticides, that proactively promotes rather than restricts biodiversity in their flocks, and so forth. Organic farms today produce a small but significant and growing percentage of the food that we eat. Gigantic food corporations say this can't be done on the scale necessary to feed the world's 7.5 billion people. So you architects, engineers, and builders who don't want to hear about what can't be done might want to examine the innovations that already exist in this smaller part of the built environment and find ways to scale them up to industrial scale levels.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here from Linda Lowe. Can you comment on those that practice medicine, nurses, doctors, etc., and if you see them as part of the solution in transforming the healthcare system? Have the extraordinary challenges they are facing in this pandemic had an impact in moving them towards action?
I totally understand the question, and I understand the spirit in which it is offered, because along with all of my neighbors, we go outside at 7 o'clock every day to applaud the first responders, which are the people that this questioner is talking about. And not only the nurses and doctors, but the researchers who are working on the technological solutions. And yes, absolutely. I think the questioner was asking, is this creating more political conscience in these people? And absolutely it is. They are leading the struggle to convince people that this inconvenience of having to wear masks all the time and gloves is really helpful. And so it's their influence, I think, that when I go out in our part of the country, everybody's wearing masks. Everybody understands it. Nobody likes it, but everybody understands that that's what we have to do to protect each other. And I think it's the first line responders, the nurses that the questioner was talking about, especially, and the nurses union that are doing a wonderful job of that.
That's great. We have a couple of questions here from people about whether Scandinavian countries or Cuba do a better job of directing science and technology than we do here in the United States.
Good question. And I'm sorry to say, yes. I think our scientists are first rate. Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing the scientists, but the political constraints that they're working under, as you can see from poor Dr. Fauci's face on television, is mean that the answer to that question is that the Scandinavian, well, take back the Scandinavian countries as a whole, because Sweden, as you know, is trying to do the herd immunity thing, which most scientists don't think is a good idea. And it's my understanding that it hasn't worked out well for them. So let's not say all the Scandinavian countries, but generally where science is practiced and respected by the governments, it is. Cuba is a special case. They have done a remarkable job. First of all, on their own island, they've kept the infection rate very low. And I've always noticed that in any kinds of emergencies, especially in the yearly hurricanes that devastate that part of the world in the Caribbean, one country will lose 100,000 people and Cuba will lose 3 because they're organized. They know what they're doing. They respect the scientists and they pay attention to that. And so also, I want to give a shout out to the Cuban medical doctors who go all over the world, including to countries like Italy, to try to help people in other parts of the world. It's a remarkable situation. So there's much more that could be said about Cuban medicine. And I say it in the book that I put on the screen, which will be coming out in July. Excuse the plug.
That's okay. We have a question here from Nizar Izura. Nizar, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Is there a historical precedent for the architecture, engineering community professionals mobilizing collectively and creatively for the purposes of public welfare, specifically in defiance of large private interests?
I wish Nizar were here by me. I actually know him as a fellow member of Science for the People, which is a wonderful organization, and I'll give a shout out to Science for the People now too. Nizar, you're going to be very disappointed, but I can't think of a good example right now. Before next time I see you personally, I will. I know that the creators of the built environment have an immense impact on the social environment. The best example anybody can ever think of is from the series of French revolutions in the 19th century, where the revolutionaries would make a lot of political gains by blocking the narrow streets with barricades. They barricade these narrow streets. And so the people in charge decided to mobilize the engineers and architects for the wrong reason, to try to make that impossible. But they did, out of that, create a beautiful city in Paris with these wide boulevards that you can't block anymore with barricades. So that's a negative example. No, I'm going to have to pass, Nizar. I'm sorry. I'll get back to you. And you can educate me next time we have a Science for the People meeting.
Great. We have a question here from Tristan Hedges. Tristan, great to have you join us. How might we motivate government and communities to build the schools, hospitals, and refugee centers in lieu of playgrounds for the rich?
Gee, if I had that question, it would already have, the answer to that question, it would already have been done. That's the problem. That is the problem that I'm talking about in this presentation, is how do we move them? The general answer is what you're seeing outdoors right now, if you look out your window, is millions of people in the street angry at something that's happened recently in terms of murderous effect to the Black community and disrespect to the Black community. And not only the Black community, but many, many other Americans are out expressing their displeasure. And unfortunately, that's one of the few ways that we have to express our displeasure. There's also the ballot box, and we can't ignore that. But in my view, I think more often than not, the powers that be heed actions like millions of people in the street, because the elections are sometimes finagled in a way that's hard to tell what people want as a result of the election outcomes. So I'm not saying that the elections are to be ignored. I think the election in October is coming up in October is very important. But still, I think more important is what we do in our civil organizations, our political organizations that operate on a day-to-day and week in and week out basis.
I think that, yeah, that's very astute. I think that largely the protests throughout the United States have been peaceful. There have been a handful of examples where things have not gone peacefully, but I agree with you. There have been so many people on the streets in many, many cities all across the nation.
I would like to say one thing quickly about the violence and the looting and things like that. It's real. It's a reflection of anger. Sometimes there may be more to it than that, but essentially it's a sideshow. And I was reminded that last night by someone on television talking about a huge demonstration when somebody lit fire to a trash can and the flames went high, and 30 reporters went around and took photos of the trash can. And that's what was shown. So, but it's really the sideshow, and we just have to keep that in mind.
That's a good way of framing it. We have a question here from Diane Wang. What do we say to young people considering going into the engineering profession right now? Is there any chance they will be able to find a path in the context of profit-based constraints? How horrible to study and prepare to address global warming and then to end up just trying to get a job to build a better golf course, or I might add, pay off your student loans.
Thanks for that question. I think it's a great one. And I think, well, that's one of the main questions generally that Science for the People tries to answer. And so anybody that wants to follow up on what I'm saying should go to the website, Science for the People, and find out what's going on, listen to the webinars that they present and so forth. I was thinking about this same question, not specifically in terms of architects and engineers in the building construction industry, although that's an important part, obviously, but science and technology as a whole, and especially the military industrial complex. And of course, a lot of the AEC industry is devoted to military industrial complex. So it's all part of this questioner's concerns. I have my own experience. I worked for Lockheed, as you said in the introduction, Margie, way back when, at the beginning of the Vietnam War, and had a good living going, making a good salary, and at first thought nothing of it. But then when the war began, and I saw that Lockheed C-130s were a staple of the Vietnam War, I was very upset by it. I went out and demonstrated, and I finally decided I couldn't do it anymore. I was going to leave. So I quit, and it took me 8 or 10 months to find another job. And I quit. It cost me, but I never regretted it. But I don't recommend that young scientists and engineers and architects quit their jobs just because they're working for a company that's not doing what they wanted to do. But I think you have to engage in social, uh, so, try to organize other people, organize for the social goals that you want, and that's the way to proceed. I hope that's an adequate answer.
We have a lot of young leaders from different professions, architecture and engineering, who've joined us on the call. And I want to, for their benefit, call out a question from Dean Reed here, which is, what is the first step for young professionals, people in their first few years of their job, leading their companies? What's the way that they can start to innovate in the way that you describe?
Well, I can think of my own path of development when I left the military industrial complex and became a teacher. I joined a teachers union and I got active in it. And I think that a lot of you probably don't have unions to join. The union movement in the United States is at a historically low ebb, which is a shame. Anything you can do toward changing that would be valuable. But you will have professional organizations like the CIDCI, and I believe that they're inviting me to speak today indicates that there are people in your organization that are interested in talking about and thinking about these things. But again, the key word is organization. You have to get into you got to get a lot of people involved. You alone can't do anything. You quitting your job isn't going to do anything. But if you can get a lot of people interested in understanding the social issues, and then the next step is to figure out how to go about it, and that's the big question. The status quo is very hard to change. That's what the innovations we need.
Cliff, it's been so fantastic to have you join us. I wanted to give you just one last moment to share any thoughts to questions I didn't ask and should have asked, or any last thoughts you have for our community.
Oh, let me think. I could get out my book and start reading it, but that would take a while. So, no, I think that I was able to say just about everything that I had to say for this audience, and I hope you'll. I'm very happy for the opportunity that you gave me to talk about these things, and I think that this is not a unique thing. I think in every profession, people are beginning to think more and more about it because of what I was talking about the COVID-19 crisis, the collapse of our economy, and how that's being addressed, and what we need to go forward. I think all of this is a healthy development for us that we're talking about these things. And I thank you, Margie. I thank you, Monica, for operating the slideshow, and I thank everybody who tuned in today.
And Cliff, just one more thing. We have a few people in the chat asking about your book. Do you mind mentioning that one more time?
It's called The Tragedy of American Science. It's published by Haymarket Books. Thank you very much.
Can you also show a cover of your first book, Cliff?
It's easy to find online, A People's History of Science.
Great. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us. This concludes CIDCI's online salon. Thank you, thank you. Our next salon will be Ann McSorley from Atlanta is going to join us with a presentation called Running from Tigers, Mental Health in the Workplace Post-COVID. Her presentation will take us a step beyond Rex Miller's presentation a few weeks ago about returning to work. Anne focuses on the trauma that we've all experienced throughout the COVID epidemic and how this might impact the workplace. It's an amazing presentation that you won't want to miss. Sign up to receive notification of these salons by subscribing at CIDCI.org. That information is also in the chat box. Thanks to our audience for joining us. If you have thoughts or comments, please go reach us at the CIDCI website's Contact Us link. And special thanks to Monica Zwisler for keeping us on track and Cliff Conner for an amazing presentation. We can't thank you enough.